Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, Jacob, some weeks it's quite easy to have a conversation about Brexit, the government and the talks, because there's a straightforward story to follow. There may be a European Council meeting, as there'll be shortly, or there may be a crucial vote in Parliament. But today, I rather feel we're chasing what the Bible calls wars and rumours of wars, in that there are a whole series of stories and claims floating around in the aftermath of the conference. Stories about the customs union, stories about Ireland in relation to the customs union and in other ways, stories about the Prime Minister allegedly seeking support from the Labour Party, cabinet divisions, the question of whether Chequers is still alive. So I'm going to ask you the ultimate softball question that actually I think is harder than it seems, which is, what on earth is going on?
Well, I think your quotation from the Book of Revelation is only too appropriate, that we don't know what's going on, and this is a difficult period because you find that lots of stories go out, people react to them, but the stories may have no basis in fact, and you get an overreaction. So, the Sunday Times is reporting that Tory MPs may vote down the budget. It's not a bad story in itself, it's an interesting thought, and there is a germ of truth in it. That is to say that if the Prime Minister stood up and said, actually, we're going to remain in the European Union after all, and it was all a big mistake, and like the dream sequence from Dallas, it's ended, you would find that Tory MPs would vote against anything the government did in that extreme circumstance. But it's a long way from where we realistically are. So the story isn't wrong, but it's not something that's likely to happen soon.
Can I just pick you up on that one story, since we're now chasing after stories, and ask you about another reading of it, which was that the ERG and other Eurosceptics and Brexiteers need to show the Prime Minister they mean business. And so they will find a reason to vote against part of the budget just to show her they mean business. Well,
I don't think that's the way it works from my point of view. If the government doesn't realise that the Brexiteer means business, mean business, then the government is more slow on the uptake than anyone could reasonably suppose. And I think that when the customs bill was going through and the ERG put down an amendment to it, which the government accepted, that showed the serious-mindedness of the ERG and other Brexiteers. Very often, your strength is in not using your strength rather than in showing off about it. I'd always be very wary about getting into trials of strength over unrelated issues. But to try and come back to your question, the honest answer is I don't know where we are. That the EU is talking about papers or not having papers this week. There are rumours that the EU likes 20 to 30% of Chequers, but that's actually slightly old news because that's basically what Mr. Barnier said earlier in the year, as soon as when the Brexit Select Committee went to see him, that there were good bits of Chequers. Unfortunately, from the government's point of view, that doesn't include the key parts of Chequers. There are stories that the government is going to come up with a backstop that leaves us in the customs union forever, which I think would be quite hard to get through Parliament. So we've got to wait and see what actually happens. And in my view, hold fire, wait for announcements, wait for a degree of clarity, and not try to shoot at shadows.
So, one message I've picked up very clearly from you is that the ERG is not bustling about in drawers looking for a pistol to hold at the Prime Minister's head over the budget. So let's stick with Chequers for a moment and that interesting thought about the 20 to 30%. Is that 20 to 30% in any way likely to include the key elements of Chequers, which the EU was so dismissive of at Salzburg, namely, first, the very complicated customs proposals, and then second, the proposal to separate manufacturing and services, which they seem to see, and the kind of group around France and Macron in particular seem to see, as a threat to the integrity of the internal market?
It doesn't seem like it, and I would have thought that if those two items were to change, Mr. Barnier would have to resign, because he's made it so clear that those are impossible in terms of the negotiation he's conducting. And if the heads of government went over his head and said, no, that's all right, his position would be absurd. So I think it's very hard to see those two elements, the key elements, working, which means there needs to be some thinking beyond Chequers. And Ian Duncan-Smith had a very important piece in the Sunday Telegraph where he set out how the British government could cooperate with the EU to ensure that selling goods to the EU required abiding by EU rules and would allow, on the Le Touquet principle, for EU officials to be able to carry out some work in the United Kingdom, the whole of the United Kingdom, not an iota of separation between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I think that's important because if you take the EU's concern over the integrity of the single market seriously and work out how it can be protected in terms of those who trade with the EU, then that opens the way to Super Canada for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I think Ian's contribution to the debate is therefore crucial, and there's precedent for it. There's the Proceeds of Crime Act, which says that if you make money from something that is illegal in a foreign country, even if it's legal in the UK, because you've done it illegally in the foreign country, that is still a proceed of crime. And so we have already legislated, some years ago, for the laws of other countries to have, admittedly in this case, a secondary effect, but an effect in the United Kingdom.
Ian's proposing, in effect, to give the EU some certainty about goods that might come into Ireland and therefore into the EU by proposing that EU inspectors or staff are allowed to be stationed at ports in Northern Ireland, the 6 ports, yes.
Well,
that's the core of the idea.
But at Dover, and at Bristol and at Liverpool, so that you would be able to check goods wherever they're going. It's not an Irish question. It's very important to look at UK-wide solutions, but it would be just as unlawful to take goods from Kent over to Calais as it would to cross the Irish border if they didn't meet EU regulations.
Just out of interest, was that idea in the... I don't remember seeing it in the, I thought, very thorough ERG document on Ireland.
It's a fleshing out of what we were pointing towards. We didn't say it explicitly in the document, but it was the direction we were looking at.
And someone on Twitter said, oh no, well you can't do that. At the moment you've got EU staff or inspectors as opposed to, say, French. You've dragged the European court in.
Well, that's a very valid point. What would the role of the European Court be in this? That the rules you would be applying would be EU rules. They're not technically EU inspectors, as it happens. They're all national inspectors. But you would be accepting that if you were a UK company that had decided that as a matter of business it wanted to sell into the EU area, as a matter of UK law, it would have to do so in a way that met the laws of the European Union. Now that doesn't bring the ECJ into the direct jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, but absolutely the rules of selling into the EU are determined by the ECJ. But I don't think that's problematic. The rules of selling into the United States are determined by the US Supreme Court.
They're national staff, you say, not EU staff?
as I understand it, the customs staff are employed by the individual nation states, not by the European Union.
So it would be whoever the nation state wanted to send, not
That's right. It would be basically like the Le Touquet principle, where French immigration takes place at St Pancras.
Okay, let's park that and just go back to Chequers for a second. And the 20 to 30%. This presumably is what I suppose we've all come to think of as the relatively easy bit, namely mostly the security arrangements and so on. That's what Barnier was alluding to by the 20 to 30%, I presume.
I assume, yes, but as you said at the beginning, we've got to be quite careful at the moment because there will be announcements. Announcements will be coming over the next couple of weeks up until the council at the end of the month. And I think it's sensible to respond to what actually happens rather than what may happen. You can get a lot of overheated opinion on things that never actually happen. And I'd rather overheat at the point at which it matters rather than over things that aren't going to happen.
Do you get the sense that Downing Street is still committed to the elements of Chequers to which the EU objected so strongly at Salzburg, namely the customs plan and the separation of manufacturing and services together with this idea for manufacturing of a common rule book? Do you think they're still clinging to this, hoping the EU will change its mind?
As far as one can tell, yes. There's no indication otherwise. I mean, the Prime Minister didn't mention Chequers in her address to the party conference, but the content of Chequers was still there, as far as one could tell. So there's no evidence that the government has chucked Chequers. They may simply be emphasising it a little bit less clearly.
It is the case, isn't it, that the most straightforward route forward, I mean, allowing for my bias and everyone else's, is a Canadian flavoured one, because in terms of the negotiation, you really boil the problem down to one big thing, which is the backstop. You can solve the backstop and the proposed division of Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, then they don't really have objections to the Canadian model, as they keep trying to remind us. Whereas, if the government sought to go down a more Norwegian flavoured route, you're immediately in trouble with all the things that cause so much trouble with Chequers, dividing the internal market, manufacturing from services and all that. So surely the direction in which the policy naturally floats a bit is towards Canada.
Yes, I think the most likely outcomes are Canada or a no withdrawal agreement and moving to WTO terms. I think those look the most likely at the moment. I think we would get to Canada relatively straightforwardly if the government made getting to Canada its priority. I think the Irish border question is solvable based on the work of the ERG and the addition from Ian Duncan Smith, and that's why what Ian was writing on Sunday was so important.
And just thinking forward again about Chequers and Canada and all that, of course, the Commons won't vote, strictly speaking, on Chequers or Canada. It'll vote on a withdrawal agreement, if there is one, and on a political declaration, if there is one. And the question is, might the government in the EU seek to blur the political statement into what's vulgarly known as Chequeda, i.e. it's so vague you can't really be sure what's in it. Now, if it does that, I can see that the objection of the Commons might be, well, why are we paying £40 billion for nothing we can clearly make sense of? But the government will be worried if there are too many specifics. The specifics will be attacked by people in the Commons for one reason or another. So where's the balance lie for this in the government?
The two have to be tied together. You have to have the withdrawal agreement and the next stage as part of the whole. We have to get something in return for £40 billion. The House of Commons will not vote for £40 billion to be spent to achieve nothing.
Would it be acceptable to stay in the customs union de facto after 2020?
I can't think why it would be. I'm very strongly opposed to staying in the customs union because that means the EU remains in control of our trade policy. So we deny ourselves one of the great advantages of leaving the European Union. We maintain high prices of food, clothing and footwear. We hit the incomes of the least well off in our society. Seems a grave error to me.
And again, we're chasing shadows, but this issue of the customs union and the customs arrangements has really dogged discussion of Brexit practically since the Prime Minister started giving speeches on the subject, because while single market membership was clearly ruled out, the position on customs has always been a bit less clear.
The thing to remember with customs union is, or with the customs union, it can't be the customs union, because being the customs union you have to be a member of the EU. To belong to a customs union doesn't mean you have frictionless trade. Turkey has more friction inside the customs union, or a customs union, than Norway has outside the customs union, but inside the single market. And I think there's been an error in thinking that if you're inside a customs union, you will have frictionless trade. That doesn't follow. What you will have is high tariffs, inefficiency, the protection of poor continental businesses. If you believe in free trade and you think there are advantages in free trade, then the worst outcome is remaining in the customs union, which is one of the worst elements of the European Union.
Do you think the lobbies that are seeking for us, in effect, to stay in the customs union are in effect hoping that the next stage would be, oh, well, if we're going to do that, we might as well follow all the single market rules?
That would make sense, wouldn't it? That if you want to be in the customs union for frictionless trade, you need to be in the single market as well. And that means not leaving the European Union.
Someone I spoke to yesterday who's followed all this closely said a big problem is the Treasury has not put enough work into developing our customs systems, and our customs systems won't be ready even by 2022.
I thought the head of Customs and Excise had said the opposite, and that they would be ready. I think he gave evidence to the Treasury Select Committee some time ago saying that that would happen, because it coincides with an upgrade in the customs system anyway, and that it's merely a question of extending it. But these are issues that need to be taken up with HMRC and with John Thompson. But
you've never had any discussion with anyone from HMRC about what they'd do if there was no deal and they suddenly found they had to run a system next spring?
No, but you don't need to, because that becomes a matter of our own implementation, and we simply say, well, everything can carry on coming in from the EU as it is until further notice.
So the problem, therefore, doesn't really arise in the spring, whatever happens.
Look, you might be taken to the WTO tribunal for not applying things fairly and evenly, but if you were developing a system that was fair and even, you would be all right in terms of the WTO. The WTO allows for exemptions and transitions, and anyway is very slow. So by the time you'd got the tribunal decision, you would have managed to implement something.
What do you think the WTO would do if we didn't impose any checks at the Irish border, as is our intent if there's no deal?
As I understand it, and people like Shenko Singham know more about this than I do, there are no issues with the WTO on this. It would be our only land border, and there are exemptions for neighbouring states. There are exemptions for security reasons. There are also requirements for consistency on each border. But we would be consistent because we've only got one land border, and therefore it would be the only way, only place where we had a completely open structure, because it was the only one that we had.
Just thinking about this out loud, that would suit us. That would suit the Irish government. Arguably wouldn't suit other parties in the EU who are worried about our pestilential goods or pestilential goods from elsewhere in the world pouring over the border into the EU. I'm thinking particularly at the moment of the French.
Yes, and the French would have to decide, did they want to force the Republic of Ireland to put up a border? But that would be a matter for them, it wouldn't be a matter for us. And what would they do about it? Would they take us to the WTO? Well, perhaps they would, and the WTO would then have to decide whether we were within our rights, as I believe we would be, but obviously these things have to be settled ultimately through processes of law? Would they make the Calais border particularly difficult out of spite and then see the economy of Calais decline? And queues, bear in mind, if there are queues at Dover, there are queues at Calais. This is not cost-free for the French, if the French wish to be particularly difficult.
Has it been discussed very much when the prospect of a no-deal Brexit comes up that if it happened, you'd have a commission in flux, really, because the commission's going out, isn't it?
Yes.
And you'd have European parliamentary elections, so there's presumably turbulence in the parliament. So the Brussels civil service, as it were, is more powerful than ever in these circumstances, one would have thought. And the person at the top of that is Martin Selmayr.
I wonder whether it works that way or whether the nation states are most powerful, because the Commission works through its commissioners, and so yes, the permanent bureaucracy would be powerful, but the member states also would at that point be more stable, more entrenched than the other two pillars.
Although we Brexiteers have spent years and years pointing to the various outrages that go on within the Commission and the way the Commission uses its leverage at the expense sometimes of the interests of the nation states.
That's true, yes.
What do you think of the Prime Minister's common theme, both in her speech and in her article in The Observer yesterday, that very clearly was a renewed pitch to Labour voters? In particular, did it strike you that there's any connection between this pitch and these explorations for the support of Labour MPs over Brexit that we've been reading about?
Well, the best pitch for Labour voters is to deliver Brexit properly. And that's going to help improve the standard of living of the least well off in our society, who are more often than not Labour voters, and helping them is really important. In terms of getting Labour votes to get the government's Brexit policy through, I thought your piece on Monday hit the nail on the head, that that's all very well, but you've got to keep your own party united, and the Labour Party is very conscious of its previous splits and the benefits that that has had for conservatism. And I think you also make the point that the Labour Party is fundamentally more tribal than the Conservative Party. And the numbers being talked about are simply not enough. I mean, at the weekend it was speculated there were 25 Labour MPs. Well, there are more than that on the Eurosceptic side who will vote down a bad deal, a Chequers-based deal.
Just on a point of fact, I think I also said in the piece that we've been round this course once before, because there was a fuss in July, I think, when Conservative MPs found out from memory that Labour MPs were going into Downing Street to be briefed about Chequers and didn't like it entirely.
Indeed, that there was a fuss, and I think in the end it didn't happen, or it happened in a slightly different way. I can't remember what the final conclusion was. Gavin Barwell has said many times that this will have to be got through on Conservative votes, and as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, I think what he says has to be listened to very carefully, and that to go back on that very clear statement would be unwise. It would damage the party, it would split the party.
How do you reconcile that clear commitment with these strange stories we're reading? Do you think people are chasing after shadows, or is there some intent in Downing Street somewhere to try to rely on Labour votes to get something through that some Conservative MPs wouldn't like?
Well, to be fair, that has to some extent already happened, because there are 4 or 5 Labour MPs who are Eurosceptics who have backed the government's desire to leave the European Union. Though I think that's slightly different, because they're voting in line with the referendum result and indeed with their own manifesto. I think to cook something up that you knew your party didn't like and went against your own manifesto and push it through under opposition votes would be very damaging to the party.
I think you've answered the question I'm going to put to you now already, but our pro-EU readers, of whom there are some who comment below the line, would say, come on, Jacob, you can't make a fuss about all this. You're perfectly happy to work with Labour MPs when it suits you.
Yes, and that's a valid criticism for people to make. I think it's partly a question of numbers. And I think it's partly a question of those Labour MPs helping to vote for what was in the Conservative Party's manifesto rather than something that wasn't. I think to use the opposition essentially to get through opposition policy would be bizarre. To use the opposition to back what has been your avowed policy, the Lancaster House speech and the Conservative Party manifesto, is simply different. And I think most people understand that, actually.
What did you think of the Prime Minister's speech?
Oh, it was very good. I thought the tone was excellent. Her self-deprecation was really skillfully and charmingly done. I loved the line about I've been up all night supergluing the set. I thought it was a very nice and it was a humanising touch. The Brexit side of it was not particularly new, and there was an effort to move more to domestic policy. I think on domestic policy there is a lot more to be done. We've discussed before housing, which I think is the key to the Conservatives' re-election prospects, and that we need to be bolder. I think the country is ready for bold policy on housing. We see today 40% of people can't afford the deposit for a house aged between 25 and 34, and it was 10% 20 years ago. There are real problems with the housing market. That needs to be a focus of government policy. The government keeps on talking about higher taxes, which is not a Conservative policy, and we need to be thinking about how we reduce taxes and follow the example of the corporation tax cut, which has led to a massive increase in revenue. And we need to refocus on domestic policy. And we do need to look at the universal credit. I was worried to read that that's leaving people £200 a month worse off. If that's right, that's really serious, and that's not how people like me who have supported universal credit consistently ever thought it was going to work.
Interesting you raise this. We're having a proper look at it on Con Home, and I suspect that the Department of Work and Pensions is making the old familiar point that for this to work, it's got to be funded, which was the source of the disagreement between Ian Duncan Smith and George Osborne in the David Cameron era, was it not?
Well, you see, I think LAFA works at both ends of the spectrum, both in employment and in unemployment. That is to say, if people keep more of the money that they have coming into them, they will work more. They have a strong incentive. And therefore the withdrawal rates of benefits has as strong an incentive to encourage people to work more as the rate of taxation. At over 90p in the pound, as it was under the old system, there was no point in working because it actually cost you to go out to work. Once you paid for childcare and you paid for transport, you lost money going out to work. At 63p in the pound, it is still too high. And that is where the Treasury ought to be funding it. And the other saving the Treasury tried to make was the initial 6 weeks delay before you were paid. Now, that's completely unreasonable. It's very hard for anybody to go for 6 weeks without receiving any income, let alone those living on subsistence incomes. And that has been to some extent tackled, it's been ameliorated, but actually it needs to be dealt with properly so that these delays aren't there. And I think these costs are Treasury costs. That is to say, they're not a dynamic forecast of the changes in behaviour that you would get if you funded it properly. And I think you would actually save money if you funded it properly. And that's what I would encourage the government to do. You've got to be careful of spend to save. That as an argument, it's very often wrong. But you are allowed to look at dynamic effects, which is, of course, what they did with corporation tax all those years ago, and they worked out they would get more revenue before they cut it.
This is a very interesting bit of the conversation. In fact, in a future Moggcast, if Brexit ever allows us, we must get back to the budget and the choices that the government's got to make over tax spending. But we've had a good Brexit run around. You like the Prime Minister's speech. You presumably can see no reason why she shouldn't lead the party into the next election.
I'm supporting the Prime Minister. My position remains the same.
Well, you've been on your very best behaviour today.
I'm always on good behaviour.
Quite exceptionally good behaviour, which some of our readers, of course, will see in their terms as bad behaviour, but we will pass that by. You're being outstandingly careful as we wait, and why not, as we wait to see what will happen next. So thank you very much for our
Not at all.
conversation this morning.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.